I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this. My name is Jake Turner, and I used to be a martial artist with a promising future. But all that changed the day jealousy consumed me, leading me down a dark path that ended in tragedy. It all started a few years ago, when I met Anna at a local martial arts gym. She was a breath of fresh air, full of life and passion for the sport, and with a passion for sports. She also loved watching the Kung Fu Panda show because it greatly inspired artists like us. We became good friends, occasionally spending time together and watching our favorite Kung Fu Panda show, which had become a shared favorite for both of us. Our connection was instant, and soon we were inseparable, both inside and outside the gym. Our relationship flourished as we shared a love for martial arts and dreams of the future. As time passed, I started feeling insecure. Anna was getting a lot of attention for her skills and hard work, earning compliments from our teachers and classmates. Instead of being happy for her success, I allowed jealousy to grow inside me like a poisonous snake. One day, after a particularly intense training session, Anna approached me with excitement in her eyes.
"Jake, I've been offered an opportunity to train with renowned martial artists in another city. It's the chance to take my skills to the next level,"
she said, her voice filled with enthusiasm. Instead of being happy for her, I felt jealous. Fear started to fill my heart, and I had some crazy thoughts. I couldn't handle the idea of her doing better than me and getting more recognition. Right then, I made a decision that would affect both our lives forever. As Anna shared her dreams, I started feeling angry. We were in the park where we usually talked about our future, with kids playing and birds chirping around. The pressure and the fear of losing her got to me, and I lost control. Suddenly, I took out a knife from my pocket. The shiny blade caught her attention, and confusion turned into fear on her face.
"Jake, what are you doing?"
she asked nervously, stepping away. I can still remember the desperation in her voice, but at that moment, my mind was filled with jealousy and crazy anger. I attacked her, stabbing her over and over while she begged for mercy. The peaceful park turned into a terrifying and horrible scene. As Anna's life faded away, I stood there with the knife, surrounded by the broken pieces of our dreams. The reality of what I had done hit me hard, and a deep feeling of guilt and regret replaced the irrational jealousy that drove me to commit such a terrible act. Full of panic, I fled the scene, leaving behind the life I once had and the woman I claimed to love. The city lights blurred as I drove away, and my mind raced with the weight of what I had done. I knew there was no going back. Days turned into weeks as I evaded the authorities, constantly on the move, and tormented by the memory of that fateful day. The guilt weighed heavily on me, and the faces of those who cared about Anna haunted my dreams. I became a shadow, a ghost on the fringes of society. One evening, as I walked through a small town, I overheard people talking in a diner. They were discussing Anna's murder, and the whole town was buzzing with the details of the crime. It was like everyone knew about it. The realization that I had become a fugitive, a monster, hit me hard, almost like being struck by a sledgehammer. The consequences of what I did are now impossible to escape. Feeling guilty, I eventually gave myself up to the authorities. The trial that came after was a mix of strong emotions: anger, sadness, and regret. The courtroom turned into a place where my life fell apart, and I had to face the results of the violence driven by my jealousy. Sitting in this chilly, lonely prison cell, I think about the decisions that brought me to this point. Jealousy, that sneaky feeling, wrecked everything I cared about. I ended Anna's lively presence with my actions, turning the martial artist with a bright future into someone convicted of murder. It's a heavy reality to face in this cold, confined space. The pain of realizing I can't fix the damage I did, and the lives I ruined, is really hard to carry. In the quiet of the night, I'm left alone with my thoughts, haunted by memories of a love that turned into a nightmare. If only I had figured out a way to overcome my jealousy, to be happy for Anna's success, instead of getting upset about it. Maybe we could have had a future together. Now, I face the silent emptiness of a shattered dream and the harsh reality of a life permanently stained by violence and regret. After getting out of jail, I realized I had lost my dream of becoming a kung fu master. The title and the path to mastery were gone because of what I did. Even though I served my time, the criminal instinct that led me to a dark place was still there, and the feeling of jealousy lingered. The dream I cherished was now out of reach, and the consequences of my actions had taken it away. I had to face the fact that the criminal instinct and jealousy were still a part of me, making it difficult to move forward and regain what I had lost. For years, I had been trying to overcome the jealousy within myself, and one day, I felt that I had changed, becoming a better person. A few days later, I re-enrolled in a martial arts, and once again, I found myself attracted to a lady. This time, however, I didn't feel jealous like before. Instead, her success began to inspire me. The funny part is that we both used to watch the Kung Fu Panda show together and found inspiration in it. I thought that maybe I had found my first love, and this thought made me quite happy. One day, while we were watching the Kung Fu Panda show together and spending time happily, she mentioned the opportunity to go abroad. She had been selected for a big tournament. Hearing this, for some unknown reason, the jealousy within me resurfaced, and I contemplated silencing her. I began to choke her, but a voice within me stopped me, and without causing her harm, I let her go. Since then, I never saw that girl again, and the artist within me has also died. Now, I am living in hiding like an ordinary person, battling the envy within me every day.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
When my Nana was very young, she was fortunate enough to have been able to meet her great-grandmother. The women in our typically Irish family tend to have their children at a young age, so it's not unusual for one of the older members of our clan to be able to meet their great-grandchildren before they shuffle off their mortal coil. Now, her great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, always wore black. She was a scathing but witty old dear, and if she didn't like you, she would say things like, "May the cat eat you and the devil eat the cat." She was also a widow, lost her husband early on in their marriage, and stuck to her vow of perpetual mourning. The experience made her a deeply religious woman, too. I mean, every Irish person has a little of the church in them anyway, but she took her faith very, very seriously after losing her husband, and I think a lot of that is down to the circumstances in which she lost him. You see, my great-great-grandfather was a sailor in the Royal Navy, which wasn't unheard of back then since we were still subjects of the British Empire, and the ship he sailed on was named the HMS Wasp. Early one morning in the year of 1884, the crew of the HMS Wasp were given the task of ferrying a gang of bailiffs and police to this place called Inistrahall, a little island off the coast of Donegal. The police had nasty business to attend to, as on the island, 3 poor families were no longer able to pay rent to the landowner and were due to be kicked out of their houses. When the sailors found out that they were abetting such cruelty, their hearts sank. The HMS Wasp has visited them previously, delivering a few sacks of potatoes when the islands were on the verge of starvation. They knew how hard life was for the poor islanders, who somehow eked out an existence on a rock that's less than half a square mile in size. The way my Nana tells it, it was so early in the morning that the sun hadn't yet risen, but the crew of the Wasp had sailed those waters many times before, and the veil of darkness was no hindrance to them. Yet somehow, the ship managed to collide with some rocks just off of a place called Tory Island. The ship went down fast, with only 6 of the boat's passengers and crew surviving the freezing cold waters. 52 sailors, policemen, and bailiffs drowned that morning, with my great-great-grandfather being one of them. The incident was a huge scandal, and mainly because it emerged that the HMS Wasp had sunk directly within sight of a lighthouse. This meant that, by all accounts, they should have been well aware of their positioning in relation to rocks they knew well were there. So, as you can imagine, a great deal of rumor and mystery shrouded the ship's sinking, and one particular explanation seemed to capture the imaginations of the mainlanders. It was said that the folk who lived on Inistrahall Island had long been isolated from the Irish mainland and viewed mainlanders with contempt and suspicion. Hundreds of years before, Christianity had been slow to make its way over to Inistrahall, and legend speaks of a massacre that occurred there after many of the islanders refused to renounce their old gods. People said that there was still some who lived on the island that worshipped pagan deities, invoking ancient curses and performing blood sacrifices. So, when a ghastly theory emerged that the islanders had used a kind of cursing stone known as a cloc terre to sink the Wasp before it could land bailiffs on the island, people actually believed it. What's worse is that the story then tells of a local priest who heard of such ungodly practices and sailed to Inistrahall. There he located the cloc terre and promptly hurled it into the ocean to cleanse the taint of paganism from the island. The same priest then safely made it back to the mainland where, by some horrible twist of fate, slipped and fell on a walkway one day and drowned in the River Finn. People were absolutely convinced it was the curse of the cloc terre, and my great-great-grandmother was one of them. Until the day she died, she believed something unholy had risen up from the ocean to take her husband away from her. Now obviously, I know that's just a silly old story my family tells, despite all my aunties swearing it's the God-honest truth. And I know because I actually did some research into the sinking of the HMS Wasp, but that didn't make what I found any less horrifying. The Royal Navy held an inquiry into the incident and were looking to court-martial the surviving sailors for negligence. Only one of the survivors had been on deck at the time of collision, and this man swore that the lights of the Tory lighthouse went dark not long before they hit the rocks. Since it was a routine journey for the crew, a junior officer was placed at the helm to gain some experience, but was so lacking in that department that he was unable to navigate in the dark, hence the ship hitting those rocks. To me, the idea of the lighthouse going dark is much more feasible than any cursing stone or what have you. But that means that the people of Tory Island colluded with the people of Inistrahall to plunge the ship carrying their tormentors into darkness. The islanders killed 52 men that morning, all to avoid being evicted from their homes. Whether or not you can blame them is another question entirely, and given that I actually lost a relative in the incident, I don't think I can give you an unbiased answer. But the fact remains that 52 people found themselves plunging into the icy waters of the Atlantic Ocean on a freezing winter's morning in complete darkness. Imagine the horror of slowly hearing the cries of your shipmates gradually falling silent until you yourself are taken by hypothermia. You certainly don't need a belief in the supernatural for that tale to give you the shivers.
As I was mindlessly scrolling through the internet a couple of days ago, a particular image caught my attention. A doll clad in a bright pink hoodie. Initially, the picture appeared innocuous, but I became increasingly uneasy as I read the accompanying caption and scrutinized the doll's features. My curiosity piqued, and I delved deeper into the matter, only to uncover a sinister truth that surpassed all my worst fears. The photo I saw turned out to be the work of Anatoly Moskvin, a former linguist, philologist, and historian, a man who was born on September 1st, 1966, in Nizhny Novgorod, Russia. When Anatoly was a child, he often took strolls through cemeteries with his friends, particularly the Krasnaya Ethna Cemetery, which wasn't very far from where he lived. They collected bottles, lit fire, and had fun among themselves. One day, during one of his leisurely walks through the cemetery, he stumbled upon a somber funeral procession. The mourners were bidding farewell to an 11-year-old girl who had departed too soon. Standing quietly, he observed as the mourners paid their last respects by tenderly kissing the girl's forehead. To his surprise, he was suddenly yanked forward and compelled to do the same. Though the experience was unsettling, he couldn't help but find the ceremony deeply intriguing. His curiosity grew more robust as time passed, and he found himself inexplicably drawn to cemeteries like an unbreakable magnet. It all began in the 7th grade, when he wandered amongst the graves and tombstones. Over time, his love for the subject only deepened. By the time 2000 rolled around, he had conducted an extensive study of not just the city's cemeteries, but many others in the surrounding regions. Besides his deep interest in graveyards, death, and burial rituals, he was also involved in some occult studies. In an interview, he described how he went to the sites to study the graves in the summer evening when there was nothing but silence. There were no watchmen, no homeless people, and no police either. Only dogs running around. Upon concluding his studies at the Philological Faculty of Moscow State University, he gained recognition in academic communities for his profound interest in Celtic history, folklore, and linguistics. He was renowned for his exceptional intellect, having taught himself an impressive 13 languages before reaching his early 30s. His linguistic prowess was widely admired, and he was regarded as a true genius and an eccentric by his fellow academics because of his weird fascination and collection of life-size dolls. In 2005, a local publisher named Oleg Ryoboy aimed to compile a comprehensive catalog of over 700 cemeteries located around Nizhny Novgorod. He was referred to Anatoly for the work, who was ready to pour himself into such a task. Anatoly embarked on a journey to visit all 752 graveyards scattered across the region. He meticulously studied the graves, processed field materials, and documented everything he saw. Despite facing significant challenges, such as the inaccessibility of motor vehicles to certain areas, he persevered and walked an average of 30 kilometers daily to reach his destination. As time passed, his peculiar work hours and frequent visits to various cemeteries coincided with a series of unsettling incidents of grave robbery. The police began to suspect him as the perpetrator, but despite their investigations, they could not find any substantial evidence to incriminate him. Even those who knew him testified that, while he may have been odd, he was a consummate professional and would never engage in such a heinous act. Nevertheless, he remained a suspect on the police's list of potential culprits. When the cases of stolen children's corpses increasingly grew and every other suspect was rolled out during the investigation, he became the prime suspect. Police then searched his apartment and garage, and 26 reported bodies were discovered. Police found instructions for making the dolls, maps of cemeteries in the region, and a collection of photographs and videos depicting open graves and disinterred bodies. He had embalmed and decorated the dead bodies into what he called the dolls. To do that, he had desecrated over 150 graves, and no one knew he was doing such a thing. After getting arrested, Anatoly started to cooperate with authorities. He expressed great sympathy for the children who lost their lives and believed they could be brought back to life through science or black magic. As an expert on Celtic culture, he had learned that the ancient druids would sleep on graves to communicate with the spirits of their dead. So he did some research and started sleeping on children's graves to determine if their spirits wanted to be brought back to life. He claimed to have been doing this for 20 years and insisted that when he began, he would only dig up the graves after getting permission from the child within. His idea of permission was asking the dead about it, and if he did not hear a denial, he would proceed with the grave digging. As he grew older, it became physically painful for him to sleep on the graves, so he began bringing the bodies to his home, believing that it would be more comfortable sleeping near them, hoping for the spirits to speak to him in a more relaxed environment. He used mummification techniques on the corpses to preserve them using a combination of salt and baking soda, and once the bodies were dried, he would carry them to his apartment. He then started experimenting on how to bring them back to life and give them more functional bodies. But he started stuffing them with rags and paddings when he could not prevent them from shrinking. He would sometimes use wax masks decorated with nail polish over the faces and dress them in brightly colored clothes and wigs. Whatever he did with the bodies made them appear as large homemade dolls, which was why no one suspected him. He said he knew what he was doing was illegal, but he did it because he felt the children were calling out to be rescued. And Natalie denied doing anything else to the bodies and said that he thought of those dolls as his children as he revealed his desire to have a daughter. He used to speak to the corpses, sing songs to them, and often watch cartoons with them and even hold birthday parties for them. He was later charged with 5 years in prison for desecrating graves and dead bodies. After that, it was evaluated that he had paranoid schizophrenia and was deemed unfit to stand trials. Natalie was then moved to a psychiatric clinic, and in September 2018, his doctor stated that he was better and petitioned the court to release him. Another psychiatric evaluation in February 2019 found it too early, and the hospital withdrew their petition.
During my time in college, I had a friend whose dad owned an 800-acre piece of land in eastern Texas. In the past, he leased it out to hunters and paper companies, but was no longer doing it. He had built a cabin on the land a few years before and would let us go out there from time to time to mess around. It served as a great way to relax from the pressures of school and getting closer to nature. The spring break of 1997, we loaded up our trucks and headed for the cabin. Our plans included shooting guns, drinking beer, and other things rednecks like us do in the woods. Our first morning kept us pretty busy cleaning the cabin and moving all our stuff inside. Around dinner, we made a big fire outside and cooked a bunch of steaks and fried potatoes. We skipped dessert and broke open some beers. The sun went down not long after, and for the remainder of the evening, we got loaded and passed around a joint or two. At some point in the night, I heard a shuffling noise outside and went out to check on it. The fire was barely burning at that point, and just outside of its light, I swore I could see the shape of a man standing completely still. From what I could tell, he was facing me, perhaps waiting to see what I would do. I blinked my eyes real hard to get a clearer look, but my position and the lack of light made it hard to see clearly. The shape continued to stand still, so I decided I'd walk up a little closer in hopes of getting a better picture. The thought terrified me, but I was transfixed by the being, or perhaps I was still too intoxicated to make wise decisions. I took 2 steps forward, but was distracted by a voice behind me. My friend had woken up and noticed the door was wide open. So he got out of bed and saw me walking around the fire. His voice caused me to jump a little, but I soon realized who it was speaking. I asked him if he saw the figure on the other side of the fire pit. He just laughed at me and said I must be so stoned I was seeing things. We laughed it off and returned to bed. On my way, I turned back to take one more look, but the shape was no longer there. I chuckled to myself and went back to sleep. The next morning, I wrote the whole experience off as the result of too much fun and went on with my day. We spent the first half of it fishing at the big pond. Post-lunch was shooting guns and one guy's compound bow that he had just bought. The beers and smoke were broken out after dinner. A game of poker was attempted but soon canceled in favor of another evening telling lies around the fire. On one of my many trips to relieve myself that night, I was spooked by the sound of a stick breaking close by and noped it back to the fire. The look of fear on my face made the other guys laugh their butts off. I tried to explain what had happened, but was quickly reminded that we weren't the only creatures in the woods. The reasoning seemed sound, so I accepted it. Not long after, we were standing around, involved in some deep discussion, and I turned to speak to the guy on my left. What I saw caused me to clench up so tight I could have snapped a steel rod with my sphincter. Standing within a few steps behind my friend was another man I did not recognize. It was like he appeared out of nowhere. What made it creepier was that he was staring intently at the back of his head, almost like he was trying to bore through it with his eyes. I remained frozen stiff. The longer I looked at him, I realized he was the same being I saw lingering outside the light of the fire the night before. He was average height with a long, unkempt beard. My friend continued rambling about whatever, unaware of his shadow. After several long seconds, the stranger turned to me with a blank expression and walked away. This was when my friend finally noticed my horrified look. When he spoke, the thrall of fear was released, and I began pointing and rambling about what I had just witnessed. He and my other friend laughed at me again. There was no way I was seeing things this time. I described the man, and one of them suggested he was a Bigfoot. Despite my protestations, no one was buying it, and I eventually cut my losses and shut up. However, I wasn't beat. Their mockery had made me even more determined to prove the stranger's existence. The next 2 days were quiet. No stranger, in other words, but I kept my eyes peeled for anything out of the ordinary. By our 5th morning, I was beginning to question my sanity. I'd seen this mysterious being stalking around us twice, and now it had suddenly disappeared. I resolved to put my quest on the back burner until some new evidence arose. My friend's dad had mentioned him, an owner of one of the surrounding properties, had spotted a small group of wild hogs running through his land, so we grabbed our rifles and went on the search for them. A mile or so down one of the property's many roads, we came across some hog wallows and knew we were on the scent. We went up the road, now on foot tracking them. Another mile on, we stumbled upon 3 large hogs rooting up the ground and prepared to make bacon. 2 of us chambered around as quiet as possible on our rifles and took aim. I was less than a second from saying 3 and pulling the trigger when the loud crack of another rifle filled the air, followed closely by a burst of wood and bark above my friend's head. It took a moment for it to register that we were being shot at. A few seconds later, another crack and strike, this time even closer to my friend. We weren't going to wait for a third. The friend who appeared to be the target led us down a side trail that led back to the cabin. No more shots followed as we fled. However, instead of finding safety at the camp, the shots began again. Seeing no other option, we hopped into my truck and hauled it out of there. This was a time just before the commonality of cell phones, so we had to drive the 20 miles to town to get help. After we explained the situation, we returned to the property a few hours later with some deputies. We approached slowly and remained in the cars when we parked. We waited to see if the shots would start again, but nothing happened. A cursory look around counted 3 holes in the cabin and another 2 in my buddy's windshield. Perhaps the worst was that all of our camping stuff, sleeping bags and such, were spread out all over the ground. Luckily, we'd smoked everything the night before, so the police were none the wiser. Nothing was missing but a box of .30-30 ammo and, strangely, my sleeping bag and wool blanket. A theory began to form in the deputy's mind that we had stumbled upon a squatter or poacher camping out on the property for whatever reason. They acted as if they were going to let it go, but once my friend's dad, who owned the land, heard about it, he put pressure on them to start a search. This was about the time I repeated my story of seeing someone lurking around the cabin. No one was laughing now, and my story was finally being taken seriously by somebody. The search was led around the property by my friend's dad. School had already begun again by the time it took place. It continued for a full week, but nothing other than a few old camps were found. It was assumed that he knew the heat would be on him after the shooting incident and he moved on. During the course of the investigation, several avenues were followed to ID the stranger like escaped cons, but he remains unidentified to this day. Because of the chance of another attack, our trips to the property ended. The next year we tried to camp out somewhere else, but it wasn't the same and our nature getaways died out. Within 5 years, my friend's dad had a heart attack and lost interest in the cabin. The paper company's lease were renewed and the land's trees have been used to make paper and pulpwood products ever since. Each time I jot down a quick note, I'm reminded of our awesome trips and especially the odd and terrifying week that caused them to stop. I do, once or twice a year, talk to my old college friends on the phone. As far as he's heard, that crazy stranger still hasn't been caught. We sometimes theorize as to his origins and where he may have ended up. I, however, often take this much further when I'm alone. I wonder why our so-called strangers seem to focus so much of his anger onto my friend, and perhaps, far more concerning, is he still out there waiting for his chance to finish what he began all those years ago?